Hey, Diana, did you know that lawyers can actually make more money by working less?
That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard.
Ladies and gentlemen, jurists and just curious, welcome to the Successful Barrister Podcast. Here you'll learn about marketing, management, and life skills for lawyers that probably won't get you disbarred. Hosted by Marc Whitehead, a seasoned lawyer who remembers when fax machines were cutting edge, and Diana Berry, attorney, COO, and the brains behind the scenes. Together, they are the legal world's most dynamic duo since statutes met regulations. So if you're looking to build a practice, not a prison, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Successful Barrister, where legal legends are made.
Welcome to the Successful Barrister Podcast that gives you marketing, management, and life skills for lawyers that probably won't get you disbarred. For many of our listeners, they will be familiar with our Successful Barrister newsletter, which has been around since, I believe, 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is our inaugural Successful Barrister Podcast, where we are going to make a valiant attempt to turn many of the concepts that we've talked about in the podcast for the last 7-8 years into an audible form that y'all can listen to while you're just screaming at the car in front of you why they are not staying closer to the car in front of them in your rush hour traffic. At least that's how I deal with my podcast. With me, my extremely bright, brilliant co-host, my Chief Operating Officer, Diana Singson, now going by Diana Berry. I have to remember. Congratulations. She's been recently married. Diana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very excited to have this as a resource for everyone out there.
So just as a way of introduction, why don't you tell the audience real quickly what you do for our firm and why did I feel so necessary to have you on this podcast?
Oh, I don't know. That's a great question. So as your Chief Operating Officer, we use the EOS model, obviously. And so as the integrator, actually, I kind of also oversells intake and marketing, but that seems to be your baby. So you get to play in that a little bit more than I do. Run the case management software. We use Litify, quality control, so a lot of customer service, and just general leadership and management things.
All right. So a lot of people out there are not going to know what the EOS system is. So EOS stands for the Entrepreneurial Operating System.
Which will probably be a different podcast.
Which will be probably intertwined in probably practically all of our podcasts. But just to give a little background on it, it's from the book Traction by Gino Wickman. He has transformed Traction into an actual system for any business to use, particularly service industries such as ourselves in the legal industry. So there's this concept within Traction called the visionary and the integrator. Can you explain to our audience exactly the difference? What is the visionary? What is the integrator in the EOS?
So as I understand it, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the visionary later on in the episode, actually, but so the visionary is responsible for big solutions, big ideas, big relationships, whereas the integrator gets to focus more on the details, making sure that the trains arrive on time, efficiencies, scalability opportunities, and I don't know what else I get to do.
Oh, so let me give you my simple version of this.
Oh, perfect.
Myself as a visionary, I get to think up all the dumb, crazy ideas, and then I get to pass those ideas off to you as the integrator, and I expect you to execute my whacked out ideas.
Then that answers the second question as to why you asked me to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, because this is absolutely not anything I would ever do on my
Perfect. You nailed it.
Well, now I know why I'm here.
So our podcast here is going to be targeted towards law firm owners, towards people who want to own their own law firm at some point in the future, or maybe those who are going to run maybe a specific division or section within a law firm. But this is targeted towards helping those who have an entrepreneurial vision and spirit about them. And throughout this podcast, we're going to talk about ways that we have seen over my 32 years, what has worked, what has not worked. My goal, I coach a lot of lawyers, and what I tell them is like, I want to help you build a successful practice. What we want to avoid is to make sure you don't end up just building yourself a prison. So I've seen both, and what I want to do with this podcast is to take some of those ideas that I've learned from EOS, that I've learned from Atticus, that I've learned from a lot of different coaching systems that I've been involved with, both as a student and as an actual coach myself, and try to lay those out for our listeners and to really get the dialogue going in the legal community that it doesn't have to be this long-suffering profession where we work 80-hour weeks, where like it becomes a badge of honor. How many of your kids' baseball games did you miss because you were serving the greater good of your client? That is not where we want to be. We want to be in a spot where we help people grow practices and have the practice actually serve their life, not have their life serve the practice.
So you're going to talk about that, especially from your 31 years, 32?
I'm working on 32-ish
experience.
Amazing.
Lessons learned, yeah.
I'm only 39 years old, yet I've been in practice for 32 years. I don't understand how that happened, but...
Just a savant.
Why are you rolling your eyes at that?
I didn't, but I do think it's a perfect segue into today's topic of when we were talking about how I don't know if the vision was always to have your own law firm, but you ended up there, and then how you maximized that opportunity, and the problem you saw, and kind of how you got there, and some resources that might help our listeners.
We'll get this down a little cleaner as we move forward in the next few episodes. But let's talk about what's in the news, what we've been reading lately. And here's some articles that I picked out that I gave you and I wanted to mention here as something to talk about. First one, U.S. News and World Report. It was an article on lawyer burnout, and I was reading through it, and I'm like, hell yeah, I've seen a million lawyers in this phase. But it actually gave some stats, put some juice behind it. 77% of attorneys surveyed are experiencing some form of burnout in their practice. That is basically 3 out of 4, more than 3 out of 4 lawyers are reporting having some form of burnout. Bloomberg Law, also a survey out there, reported that lawyers feel burned out more than half the time. Then there was this other after the JD study that I saw that found that 24% of lawyers are actually dissatisfied with their decision to become a lawyer, which is really sad. I mean, we put so much time and effort into becoming a lawyer, but our identities become wrapped up in being lawyers. And it is sad that so many people are regretting even the decision to become a lawyer to begin with.
And we're recording this in May. I don't know when you guys are listening to it, but we're recording in May, which is Mental Health Month I think it's just universally recognized as Mental Health Month. One of the things that we should probably just discuss is the fact that the very nature of legal work, for many of our listeners, the work is probably very reactionary. We were talking the other day about how PI attorneys, you're always waiting on trial schedules, and you're just always waiting either for that next call from the client. And so that can lead to unpredictable nature of your personal life as well.
Especially when you're young and dumb, as I have been most of my adult life. Like I said, a lot of people, their identity becomes wrapped up in their profession. And I don't know how many bar functions I've been to where lawyers will sit around and literally brag about how many hours they worked last week or how many hours they billed last year. And they kind of look at it as a badge of honor. And I start looking at them, and I'm like, one guy was telling me he billed 3,500 hours in the prior year. And I'm like, how the hell did you do that? Then, not surprisingly, the next thing he started talking about was the divorce that he was currently going through. And I'm like, yeah, no wonder you're getting a divorce. It is kind of amazing to me that this is so prevalent in our profession.
Yep. And I think for some of the attorneys that might be listening that ended up just kind of running their own law firm like you did, it might just be kind of like the engine just started, the train just left the station, and now they don't know how to stop it or even slow it down with that. I mean, because you've got to still keep the cases coming through, but you don't know how to responsibly slow down. You've got people and who you've hired that you're responsible for their salaries. And so I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about, how you did it, going from this lawyer that probably did work those same similar hours at one point in your career to now you don't carry a docket.
No, I don't.
It's terrifying, huh?
I know. And I made this decision about 5 years ago, which a lot of people still question, but just a brief history about me. And I don't mean to brag or anything, but I do think that, like I said, it took me over 30 years to start really figuring this out. But I used to do that. I used to try all the cases within our firm. I used to do all the mediations. I used to do all the depositions. I used to do all the case signups. I used to do all of the discovery. I felt that as the uber technician, the super lawyer, I felt that I had to be the one in charge and to do that. And yeah, it led to a lot of burnout. But over time, and I will point to this one incident. I believe it was in the early 2000s, maybe 01, 02, can't remember exactly where it was. And I went to a bar event. I think it was State Bar, Texas, had some convention. And I started listening to this speaker. His name was Marc Powers,
Really?
who I later learned was the owner of a lawyer coaching group called Atticus. And you will hear us talk about Atticus a lot throughout this podcast. But Marc said one thing that really, really stuck with me. He goes, I want you to go back to your office right now, and I want you to fire your worst client, and I want you to fire your worst employee. And I did it. And man, it felt good. Oh my God, it felt good. It was like this revelation. And so with that, I began to follow Marc Powers, and I started subscribing to, just on the edges, on the periphery, to some Atticus coaching events, and some of their literature. And it took me probably 5 years to get fully immersed in the Atticus system because, quite frankly, it's a coaching program. It's not inexpensive. It's at least not at first. It feels very expensive. Once you get into it, it actually feels like the best investment you ever made. But that was kind of I would say that was sort of the midway point of my law practice. So I was a good 15 years in, and I was just floundering. I wasn't sure what I was doing. And I started realizing, hey, there are things out there that can help. And Atticus was a great one. I am still a member of Atticus today, both as a coaching client and as an actual coach for Atticus. But that was just one of the first things that I learned from Atticus. And then we started talking about a lot of other innovations in the way you should think and ways you should think about your practice. Moving on that journey now, some roughly 20 years into Atticus, 31, 32 years into my practice. Now, I probably work less than 30 hours a week. I don't carry a caseload. I do not have a single case in our office. We have over 4,000 cases in our office. I have not a single case that has my name on it. Okay? And that's not accident. That's by design. My job is, as I call it, is the 3 M's. I manage the firm, I market the firm, and I mentor my lawyers. That's my job. And that takes me about 30 hours a week to accomplish. And then the rest of the time I have to spend with my beautiful wife, my beautiful kids. I go to the gym. I do whatever it is I want with my life. I travel a lot. Yes, people are constantly like, are you in the office next month? A little bit, but not much.
But I think that you kind of glossed over like that very crucial, important, that almost foundational thing where you went back, you left Marc Powers, and you went and you did the thing, which almost was ownership, a mindset shift, and taking ownership of the runaway train that was probably becoming your practice. And so let's talk about that kind of mindset that it had to have taken for you to say, okay, I'm going to fire my worst client. I'm going to fire my worst employee.
And one of the things that I had to realize is I kind of had to fire myself too.
Mm.
I will tell you that didn't happen day one. I mean, this probably took 5 or 10 years of exploration and thinking from that point forward. But I needed to start firing myself. I didn't need to take every deposition. I didn't need to attend every mediation.
Case signups.
I didn't need to do the case sign. That was one of the greatest innovations that we ever did in this law firm, is that we created a whole intake department that's not relying on attorneys whatsoever to sign up cases. We just totally cut the lawyers out of that system, except for in the most extreme cases. It radically changed the way our firm does business. It radically changes how we allocate our time, our resources. It's probably one of the best innovations that we ever implemented.
This podcast is sponsored by Marc Whitehead Associates, a national disability benefits law firm. Marc Whitehead runs a firm of over 60 dedicated people whose mission is to make a difference in the lives of our injured and disabled clients. Marc represents disabled claimants in Social Security disability, private disability insurance, and veterans disability claims in all 50 states. Marc Whitehead is double board certified in both Social Security disability law and personal injury trial law. Marc has litigated disability cases in over 40 states and counting, and can help your clients too. Stop throwing your phone calls away. Call Marc Whitehead at 701-VIP-LEAD. at 701-VIP-LEAD or visit our website at disabilitydenials.com. Referral fees are paid in all jurisdictions where it is permitted. Refer us your disability cases today and know that your clients will be in good hands.
All right, we're back. Lovely word from our sponsor. And while we were gone, Diana and I were sitting here talking about this lovely emerald green couch that we're sitting on right now, which apparently is going to get confiscated by my daughter, who's going back to the University of Texas in the fall. But for now, we're going to enjoy this lovely green couch. For those of you in the video who can see it, and those in the blog world just can't. Diana, what do we want to talk about?
Well, I think you make it sound, I'm sure the listeners are thinking, well, great, you did it. I'm sure it was real easy, Marc. But Atticus, I think, does give you, and having been an Atticus student for about 3.5 years myself, they do have great tools and break things down, very complex conceptual ideas. They break them down into steps really nicely. And particularly this idea that they have, this tool that they have. And so what's kind of step one of the Atticus tool that helped you navigate the change from this really busy attorney to, okay, I'm going to go fire my worst employee, fire myself, and have this great 30-hour-a-week life?
So what we're talking about is kind of a visual concept that we're going to have to play with describing it verbally. It's called the Atticus Practice Growth Map. And I do think it's been updated and probably has a different name nowadays. But when I was first introduced to it, it's called the Atticus Growth Map. It all starts with talking about your mindset. What is your mindset? The mind is a great thing, but the problem is the mind can also trap you when you're least expecting it. And so with the Atticus Growth Map, we kind of start at the beginning with, let's say somebody's just starting out their practice. Let's say maybe they've got a couple of years of experience under their belt, maybe working for another firm, so at least they have a concept of how a law practice is supposed to look, but working for somebody else didn't work for them, so now all of a sudden they get this, and I'm borrowing this from E-Myth, but the E-Myth calls it an entrepreneurial seizure. Like they get this seizure in their head that says, hey, I can do it myself. I don't need to work here. I can start my own practice. I can do this better. And they think just because they understand the technical side of law, they understand how to be a lawyer, to practice law, that they actually can go out and actually run a business.
Law firm.
I'm sorry, people. I heard it a million times in law school. We're not a business. We're a profession. That's bull. That is absolute BS. We are a business. We are in the business of selling legal solutions, but we are no different from the TV repairman, from an oncologist, from a plumber, or anybody. We are simply sell solutions.
Well, and I think that's the key, is to recognize that when you can accept that whole mindset shift, then you actually have a chance at developing a scalable practice, or a practice that doesn't run you, right? That works for you and provides for you and allows you to travel rather than just being locked in the four walls of your practice.
And I don't want to insult anybody out there, but I will tell you this. When I started 30 years ago, if you would have used the word scale and scalability to me, I would not have known what you meant. I honestly would not.
Yeah, those aren't law school terms. We don't talk about law school.
I mean, and just for those of you who don't know, I mean, we're talking about scale is like, all right, so I started off as a solo practitioner. And then I scaled up and became a 2-lawyer firm. And then I scaled up and became a 3-lawyer firm, and then a 4-lawyer firm. And we went from 100 cases to 500 cases to 1,000 cases. That's when we talk about scaling. So you scale up the size of your business. But every time you scale up the size of your business, you also are scaling up the complexity. And that, I think, is what so many lawyers are not prepared to do. They don't think about it like that. They were never trained for that sort of mindset in law school. They were trained to be a professional.
And I think that's the really cool idea that you have with this podcast, is to really give a unique personal perspective to your experience on how you did it, the lessons, the hard lessons you learned, and especially where we are now. I mean, you've hired someone to literally, like, you've hired a COO, which is, when I went to law school, even, actually it's been a couple of decades, but we didn't have such positions in law firms. And so I think legal services is now moving towards where medical services was probably a decade ago and starting to put real business professionals behind their law firms to help treat them like businesses.
All right, so I will challenge you on that. We are not a decade behind the medical profession. We are like 3 to 4 decades behind them. I know you were trying to be nice, but let's face it, the legal profession
So our relationship
is so far behind any other industry out there that I had a friend who hired a medical administrator to come in and run his law firm, and this medical administrator was shocked at how antiquated the legal profession was as a whole and how far behind we were in both processes and systems and in technology and just in general organizational structure that the medical profession figured out a generation ago, back in the late 90s.
which I think is cool. So keep listening and you'll hear about all the different ways that you can very easily figure out. Back to the Atticus tool.
The Atticus Growth Map. Yes, let's go back to that.
Map. And so step 1, we talked about the mindset shift. And then they recognize that the lawyer as a lawyer, that's kind of where we all start, to perfecting your craft.
Right, the Uber technician. This is borrowing a phrase from E-Myth, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but E-Myth is a great book by Micheal Gerber, and he's got a series of E-Myth books out there. But the very first phase is, as Atticus would define it, as the technician stage, when everything revolves around developing your technical skills as a lawyer. Learning to take a better deposition, try a better case, maybe figure out a better way to communicate with your clients. But basically being the best lawyer you can be. And the problem is that so many lawyers, that's all they ever do. They never leave that initial stage as the great technician stage. And they stay there for their entire career. But the problem with staying at the great technician stage is you're always doing it. Everything revolves around you. You're not building any real value. You're not building a firm that can function without you. So in other words, you're having to work 80 hours a week. You can't leave. You can't go.
Yeah, you travel, or else revenue stops.
Right. If you leave, revenue stops. That's the ultimate definition of at the great technician phase. You are responsible for all of the revenue that comes in the firm, which means you become a slave to the firm. You've built your own prison.
Yeah.
So to get out of that, how do you get out of that? Atticus would refer to this next stage, how do you get out of the great technician stage, what they call the practice leader stage, where you now have to learn not just being a great technician, you need to learn to be a great leader. You need to be able to lead other people. You need to learn to lead and develop teams of people who can actually start doing a lot of the technical work for you on behalf of the firm.
So this looks like for you, like, what does that actually look like? I mean, that's a lot of words. What does that mean for a law firm? Is that like hiring, more than hiring a receptionist, hiring your first attorney, maybe hiring an intake specialist? Atticus speak always is highest and best use.
So I think I'll go back to revenue generation. So if you are the only one firm that can generate revenue, you're a slave to the firm. The first step in going from the technician stage, the great lawyer stage, to the practice leader stage is to develop revenue sources, profit centers, as I like to call them, to develop profit centers that revolve around other people and not. Typically, that means other lawyers. Way back when, I hired my first associate lawyer. And all of a sudden, if you're running it right, that lawyer should become a profit center. If you're paying, let's say you're paying that lawyer, let's say you're somebody brand new out of law school, you're paying them $90,000 a year brand new out of law school. You should reasonably be able to expect that person should be able to generate 3 times their salary once you get them trained up and get them running. Mm-hmm. They should become their own profit center for you. Same thing if you have a paralegal that may be working files. That paralegal should be able to generate profit. It may not be directly, depending on your practice area, whether you're a flat fee or a billable hour or a contingency fee. The business model looks a little different, which, by the way, would be a great podcast. Yeah. Podcast strictly on the different business models. I like it. Somebody write that down. But every employee that you add should eventually, once they're trained up and utilized properly, should become sort of their own little profit center. Or if you'd like to think of it in a team concept, let's say, especially say you're in a contingency fee firm, you set up a team. You have a lawyer, you give them a paralegal, you give them maybe a legal assistant, and they become their own team. And that team should then start to generate profits for you without any effort on your own as the business owner. So that's, I think, the key determinant when you start moving from the technician phase to the leader phase.
And as the COO, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, but all that means that you said, once you get that lawyer trained up and running, I think were your words. So you're now creating training modules, or you're sitting down and doing one-on-one training on top of your busy docket. And you've got to get a phone system in place or an email system. You've got IT. I mean, it's a whole bunch of, this is where you get your kind of foundational systems maybe at least started.
You said the word system 3 times in that little chunk there, and you hit it on the head though, because you have to develop, as part of being a leader, part of a leader's job is to develop people. And well, how do you develop people? Well, you develop systems that help develop those people. You develop processes, you develop procedures, you develop training systems, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you hire somebody new. You develop accountability within your system so that people are actually doing what you train them to do. But hiring people is not enough. You've got to put the systems in place to allow these people to actually have systems to run.
Well, and it also ensures, it's almost like a checks and balance to make sure that your clients are still being treated the way that you want them done, that the quality of work that's being delivered by your firm is still up to your standards. And so I think that that's almost the hard part of evolving from that technician to the practice growth leaders, just to kind of like doubling your work for a little bit. But then you get to leave that phase.
Yes.
And then the systems are running by themselves, the systems and the people. They're running, you've got a profit center. What's next?
So what's next is what we'd call the market leader mindset.
Okay.
And really it's at this point that you're trying to remove yourself from the day-to-day revenue generating activity. Like I said earlier, I haven't handled a case in a number of years. My name is not on any cases. I don't generate any revenue anymore. And people will say, isn't that a bad thing, Marc? No, that's a great thing. Because what that does is that gives me the freedom to do other more important things. It gives me the freedom to manage the firm effectively. It gives me the freedom to market the firm. It gives me the freedom to train and mentor my lawyers. It gives me the freedom to travel, to do whatever it is that I want to do, to spend time with my friends, my family, my wife.
What I guess would call my great life, right? Living your great life. But we're back in visionary, which is great and wonderful. The entrepreneurial, which is kind of the final step of the model, I think. Let's talk a little bit more about that kind of market leader position right there. I think a lot of attorneys listening, you struck fear in their hearts when you said, I just removed myself from the equation. I started to give up things. How was that?
It requires a mindset shift. If you would have asked me many years ago, removing myself from the process, objected on about 1 million different grounds. The main one is it wouldn't work without me. It would all just fall down and it would fail. And it was sort of, quite frankly, you guys sometimes have to suppress your ego a little bit. You think you're more important than you really are. But if you start thinking about the practical realities of it, a firm is more valuable the less dependent it is on, number one, the revenue producing of the actual owner and the actual day-to-day participation of the actual. The concept that we discuss at Atticus is called killing the hero. Mm-hmm. And I, as the law firm owner and founder, I'm the proverbial hero in this example. And the hero is not killed all at once. The hero is killed very slowly over time. And what that means is removing me from the process. So you look at any business. What's the first step in a business? The first step is you have to market the business. In other words, you have to generate interest in the business. What's the second thing that you have to do in a business? You have to create a sale. You have to turn that marketing prospect into an actual signed client. In other words, you got to make the sale. I know lawyers think that sales is a dirty word, so we fake it and we use the word intake, but it's the same thing. It's a sales process. And then you have to deliver on the sale. You have promised to solve somebody's problem. So now you have operations, which you have in any business. You actually have to define the problem, you have to come up with a solution, and you have to execute and provide the client a solution to their problem. And then you have to have service after the sale. That dealer sold you the Chevy, but now he's got to fix it when something breaks. So there's always aftercare with any sort of client situation. So you have to do that. And part of that aftercare is making the client feel good about the process so that client will come back again, back to the marketing and sales cycle. And now you've created this whole flywheel effect. And that's most successful practices rely heavily on referrals from their client base. And that's how you actually do that, by providing that good service and providing that follow-up care. And you start the whole process over again. The whole ideal, though, is to kill the hero, to remove myself from each of those steps. And that was the hardest part, because I used to do all the intake. I used to sign up all the cases. And I was damn good at it. I mean, I can talk to a client and I can get them to sign on the bottom line, and they come out of that meeting loving me. I was damn good at it. And that was very hard to give up. Then goes to the actual production. In our case, in a contingency fee disability firm, you've got to actually get the actual work done. And that used to be all me. And then, I start slowly giving that away to other people up to the point where I've kind of removed myself from the process, killing me from each phase of the process. Now my job is simply to supervise and to manage and to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing and make sure all the oars are rowing in the same direction.
And I think that's implicit to that is just making sure you have a team you can rely on, right? That the person that you've delegated intake to will show up when you're not there. Sure, you could step in, but the last thing that anyone wants is that, hey, I'm off on this trip. I'm trying to separate myself from work. And then all of a sudden, these people that you've relied on are no longer showing up. And so part of just inherent to this step of the Atticus tool, it's to make sure you're leading a good team, that you're incentivizing the right way, that you've put the good systems in place, right? And the systems that could be replicated easily, and that you're not a choke point for anything. Signing checks. I remember other stories still of you where you actually had to physically sign checks. And that couldn't happen if you were off traveling.
Yeah. And actually, taking a good long 2-month trip is a good pressure test to see if the systems work. How well your systems work, how well you've got your organizational structure put together is sort of defined by how long you can leave it and everything just goes fine.
Yeah, and I think that especially for service, I'm assuming most of our listeners are going to be in the service industry, at least specifically law firms. It's making sure your people, you've got the right team, that you've got not just the right person in the right seat, but that you're incentivizing them well, so they take care of your business and look after your business the same way you would when you're gone.
Exactly. And what that does, it makes your whole practice as a whole more valuable. Think about this from let's say I'm thinking about retiring, thinking I'm going to sell my practice. Well, what do I have to sell exactly? If you're stuck in the Uber technician trap where you're or the great lawyer trap, you can't sell yourself. You have no systems in place. You have nothing to sell. You have a few sticks of furniture. You might have a client list that might have a little bit of value. But what else do you have to sell? Not much, because everything that you've built relies totally upon you. Whereas if you've built a business that doesn't depend upon you at all, quite frankly, or somebody could substitute in as a manager, you actually have a sellable business that can be sold for a nice little profit, a nice little retirement nest egg at the end of your career. So a lot of what we talk about in Atticus is building your practice for sale, whether or not you actually want to sell it or not.
Well, and I think that especially for the attorneys where I am, I'm nearly 2 decades of being an attorney where we are now. I think you've hit the nail on the head, which definitely someone should write down for a future podcast, is why it's so important, right? Now you're starting to think about your legacy and what you're leaving behind. If something happens to the kids or my wife, what am I leaving to give her for either wealth or, and that's ultimately where Atticus kind of ends up in their model.
This is Marc Whitehead, lawyer, entrepreneur, and business coach. Thanks for listening to the Successful Barrister Podcast. If we've stirred your juices, hit me up with an email at marc@marcwhitehead.com. Remember, Marc is spelled with a C. And get on the Successful Barrister newsletter mailing list. Even better, let's set up a call. I'd love to talk to you about working together, talk shop, or just shooting the breeze. In this last segment, I want to talk about the 2 most influential books.
That's some pretty high praise, really.
And so really what it is, so I want to introduce, it's called E-Myth Revisited by Micheal Gerber. And this is the base book. So this is interesting. Michael's an excellent entrepreneur in his own right because he came up with one really hit book. And then he figured out how to spin a bunch of other books off of that one book to keep selling books, which is freaking brilliant. So his original book, E-Myth Revisited.
And the E doesn't stand for like e-commerce.
No, it stands for entrepreneurial.
Okay, I was very confused when we started talking about this, and so I just thought that might be a very helpful point of clarification for our listeners.
And we'll refer to it as E-Myth, but it's actually E-Myth Revisited because revisited meaning it's this version 2. So I guess he originally wrote E-Myth, and then he came out with E-Myth Revisited, which is basically a revised version of the first book. It is sort of a combo book. It's one type of book that I really love and one type of book that I really hate combined into one book, which makes it a little bit difficult from my perspective. But throughout the book, he tells a fable. This is the part that I hate. I really hate business books that tell fables, but he does it effectively. And he tells about the frustration of a would-be entrepreneur. And he'll write one chapter as a fable, and then he'll write this next chapter as more practical advice on this is what this person should have been doing. And then the next chapter is a continuation of the fable, and then the next chapter is like this is what this person should be doing.
Oh, okay.
So that's how the book is structured, which is a little bit weird. It took me a little bit of time to fall in love with the book because of that fable part, which I've never been a big fan of. But the book was successful. It was a hit. And he has spun this book off now into other professions. So he now has E-Myth for plumbers, E-Myth for real estate salesmen, E-Myth for doctors, E-Myth for dentists. I may be making some of these up. I'm not quite sure. But I can guarantee you he's also written E-Myth for attorneys. And he actually involved an attorney in the writing of this book since he is actually not an attorney. But he's applying the E-Myth concepts to the practice of law, again, in the use of sort of the fable explanation chapter. So when I talk about E-Myth, I'm talking about these two books in combination.
Okay, got it. So what would you say were the most important takeaways from the books that you would say for, like, why should our listeners read them?
Right. So again, we're talking about, the kind of the point of our podcast is talking to law firm owners or would-be law firm owners. And the very first premise that Gerber brings out is the concept of the entrepreneurial seizure, which is when somebody, in our case lawyers, they have the technical skills to be a lawyer, and they have the seizure in their brain that they no longer want to work for someone else and they want to go start their own business, their own practice. And that's what he describes as the entrepreneurial seizure. They don't really have a plan. They don't really know how to run a business. They just know that they know the technical side of the business. They know the technical side of being a lawyer. And this is what happens, is people have the entrepreneurial seizure. It's what happened to me. I had the seizure. I didn't want to work for anybody else. I wanted my own practice. I started my own practice. I knew nothing about how to actually run a practice, about how to start a business that had expenses and revenue and was designed to actually make a profit. I didn't know how to do my taxes. I knew nothing.
Systems?
I had no systems. This was back in the day. I barely had a computer. I had an old 386 that I bought from Montgomery Ward's.
I know what Montgomery Ward is. I don't know what it is.
That was my first computer. Another story for another time, but I used to be a salesman at Montgomery Ward's. I was in sporting goods and hardware.
Definitely another.
Yes, a dime for another time, another place, another time. But that's what I started with. I started with a 386 computer from Montgomery Ward. I did not have a cell phone at the time. I had a beeper. Cell phones weren't a thing back then. When we finally did get cell phones, we didn't turn them on because the per minute cost was so high that you were afraid that somebody would call you. You'd have to pay for the airtime. So we turned the phone off. We only turned the phone on when we wanted to call somebody out of desperation, and then we would turn the phone off immediately. But this just tells you how long ago all this started. Yeah, fax machines were just a thing back then, but just barely. So, I had this entrepreneurial seizure that I wanted to start a practice. And of course, at the time, I didn't know what that was. It wasn't until I read Gerber's book, many, many, many years ago that I look back and recognize, yeah, he's talking about me.
Mm-hmm.
He described me to a T back then.
Oh, wow.
I had that entrepreneurial seizure and didn't know a damn thing about how to do it. And this is sort of equivalent to the great lawyer trap that when we were talking about in the previous segment about Atticus. It's at the same general level, different terminology, but we're talking about the same. The other concept that Gerber introduces here is the role of management within a firm, within a business.
Okay.
So when you are initially the entrepreneur and you have the entrepreneurial seizure, you're the technician, but you're also the manager.
Oh, kind of that in between we were talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem is, who are you managing? Well, you're managing yourself. And sometimes that's a dangerous thing. People frequently are not good at managing themselves. And the third concept, which we've already talked about, is just simply that of being an entrepreneur. You have the vision, you have an idea, you just really may or may not know how to execute on that. So that's sort of the premise of how he begins both books, is defining this entrepreneurial seizure and kind of defining the traps and the pitfalls that come along with it that happen to all new business owners, but they're not thinking like that. They're not thinking about it in those terms. Anyway, when I first read that, I just put the book down and just was like befuddled, like, was this guy following me around?
Light bulb came on.
I mean, it's like, oh my God, he's describing me to a T, just to a T. So of course that's not, then I'm hooked. So I start reading the book, even though I hate the fable part of it. I got to continue on with the book. In the basic premise, the solution to the entrepreneurial seizure, to the trap that fall into, is that you have to learn to develop the processes and systems to run the business. People don't run the business. Your processes and your systems run the business.
Mm-hmm.
In turn, people run the process and systems. And that's the order in which it has to go. I'll go back to our intake process here, which is, I'm very proud of our intake department. Again, I work very hard.
They're very awesome.
But we had to develop processes and systems. We developed screening criteria on cases that we would accept. We created a bucket system, green bucket, an automatic take.
Red, yellow, green. Yep.
A yellow bucket for maybes that needs to be run up the flagpole to some higher authority. And then we had a red bucket. These are cases that we do not want. But we had to create that system. Then we had to hire good people to actually run that system and make that system actually work. And that is sort of the concept behind the E-Myth. And we're in a very limited amount of time, so I can't give it full justice. But the most important part of the book is simply that fact that you must develop systems to run your business, in our case, to run our law practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to find people to run the systems. And that is what makes a great visionary entrepreneurial company, a firm that is sustainable and profitable over the years. Absent that, again, you're just going to end up building your own prison.
So where can our listeners find these books?
All right. So I am, at my tender age, my eyesight is not so good. So I listen
Oh, right.
to most of my books. My cheat is I go to Audible and I have an account and I download the books, and I have a 30-minute commute every day. So I listen 30 minutes coming from work, 30 minutes going back home. I listen to a lot of books. Here's the problem. Coming up and down the highway, you're constantly ducking 18-wheelers, and you're always going to miss something here or there.
Mm-hmm.
The great thing about Audible is you can back it up and rewind it if you need to. But here's my other cheat. There are two companies out there, and I think there's probably plenty more. These are just the two I'm aware of. There's Summary.com, and then there's Summaries.com with an IES. They're competitors, but they are professional book summarizers.
Okay.
And you can go, and I think for a very reasonable sum, I think if you just want a PDF of any particular book, it's somewhere between $2 to $5. I can go get a book summary, an 8-page written summary of E-Myth for, I don't know, somewhere in that range, $2 to $5. But nowadays, they're also doing them on Audible. So you can actually listen to the summary in your car.
Yeah, very cool.
So this is how I consume most of my literature. Obviously, all of these books are available for order on Amazon or at your favorite bookstore or wherever real books are sold.
Well, I'm sure we'll put them in our show notes too.
Yes, and we'll include a link to them in their show notes.
So what else? What would you leave our audience with today?
So here's what I would do if you're really interested. I would go and get the E-Myth Attorney.
Yeah.
A relatively short read, and I would start there. And if that fires you up, then I would go back and I would get the original E-Myth Revisited. And if you wanted to cut that in half, read every other chapter that just talks about the practical advice, and you can skip the fable. That will cut the book in half. Or if you're really into fables, when I say fable, he's basically just using a individual person as an example and telling their story, trying to evoke a little bit of emotion, a little bit of humanity into his story, into his otherwise just basic business advice. Some people like that. I can do without it. This is just me personally. That would be a quick down and dirty way to get started on the E-Myth journey. And it all starts with developing your first process. And it could be written on one page. We call them right here one-pagers. Yep. It doesn't have to be long drawn out. It could just be one simple page of a simple process that you can teach to a reasonably intelligent person that they can then do this action for you over and over again on a repeated basis so you never have to do it again.
Quite the challenge for our listeners.
All right. So what's next? Well, next, we plan on the Successful Barrister to hopefully be a regular weekly podcast. We're going to find
for sure
as many topics as we can to talk about. I love talking about the various books that I have read. So frequently I envision in the future that we will find more books that I've found very useful, some life-changing, some marginally helpful, sometimes just nuggets. But my vision for this podcast in the coming weeks, months, years is to try to provide our listener with valuable advice, particularly related to how to own and run a law firm. You know, the byline on the Successful Barrister is marketing management and life skills that probably won't get you disbarred. So we might hit some life skills along the way as well. I'm on a big health kick right now, so we might cover topics regarding health, with probably certainly hitting topics regarding marketing a law firm, managing a law firm, organizational structure, lifestyle issues.
You can find us both at disabilitydenials.com for sure.
Yes, you can reach me directly. I would love to hear your feedback. My email address is marc@marcwhitehead.com. The trick is my mother spelled my name with a C, which has tormented me for my entire life because nobody...
Probably another episode.
It's probably another episode. I'll probably need some deep therapy over this. But Marc with a C at Marc Whitehead, marcwhitehead.com. And I have to remind people it's a C on both sides of the at.
That's very helpful. So thanks for listening.
To all the listeners out there, we appreciate you listening to our inaugural episode. I will give you all the usual podcast disclaimers. Please visit our website. Please give us a 5-star review. Tell your friends, your family, your coworkers, your dog, your cat, your fish, whomever about this great new podcast. And we look forward to presenting more episodes to you in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.